Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to the Inspiring Leadership Book Club. I am your host, Andrew Cohn, and this month we are talking about a really interesting, provocative, and I think very practical leadership book by Fred Kofman called The Meaning Revolution, Leading with the Power of Purpose. Fred, when he wrote this book, was the VP of Leadership Development at LinkedIn, then went on to a similar position at Google, where I believe he may still be now. He also teaches at a university in, I believe, Ecuador. I came across his work some years ago when he was a co-founder and leader of a consulting firm called Axialent. And I worked with that firm for several years. Really enjoyed their work. And this book is a follow-up to, I would consider a follow-up to Fred's book published about 10 years ago called Conscious Business, an excellent, excellent book about leadership and personal growth, I might add. And this book takes it even farther. There's some mention of some of the conscious business ideas and principles, which I'll allude to in this conversation. And then he even gets a little bit more philosophical with this, talking about the importance of meaning and purpose in leadership and in organizations and really in the business world in order to keep us engaged and productive and really locked in and doing our best work. So what I would say is first, this, bear with me one second here. This book, this is my copy of the book, The Meaning Revolution, Leading with the Power of Purpose. I think I've had this I probably bought this at about 2019, perhaps 2018. But if you look at Amazon now or other booksellers, you might see the book looks like this, The Meaning Revolution, The Power of Transcendent Leadership. And I think that's quite interesting that perhaps in a different printing or something or a different edition, that subtitle has changed because Fred talks about transcendent leadership as a new type of leadership, transcending the purely material to engage people through meaning. And so let's talk about what this is, what this means, why it matters a bit. And as I said, there's some good questions, good thought-provoking material here. I encourage you to look at this. Let me know if you have any questions about it or need some discussion questions to use. That's the business that I'm in and that we're in here. Would be glad to discuss it with you. I think there's lots of juicy material here, both in terms of, well, perhaps even more than two levels. The larger economic argument that says that people aren't motivated by money, they're motivated by meaning. So what can be done to engage people in this way? People are not molecules, which there's a story about that in the book. We are kind of conscious beings. We're going to give our labor, especially discretionary effort, voluntarily. And what's going to do that is some sense that I'm contributing to something larger than myself. One of the things that Fred talks about is a notion of certainly a noble purpose that a business can have, and how we can accomplish and achieve immortality projects so we can contribute to something that will outlive us. So, as I said, a bit philosophical here, in addition to some useful leadership principles, a bit philosophical in some of this, which I think is really cool and practical, frankly, because it invites some really useful discussion about leadership um, and about how we can all do our best work. So, Reid Hoffman, founder and former chairman of LinkedIn, wrote this: "Benevolence, service, and love are the ultimate sources of economic value. If you treat your employees as resources to optimize, you will never ascend from manager to leader. To make that leap, you must recognize your employees as conscious beings who can transcend their limited existence through noble immortality projects." Whoa, this is big language from Reid. I actually heard Reid interview Fred Kofman a few times about some of the content of this book. Um, and Fred thinks very, very highly. Reid thinks very, very highly of Fred. They make a good match. And let's get into some of the content here. There's a lot to talk about, right? But just I wanted to set the tone with that we're talking about some big ideas here. So the book is divided into 10 different chapters. And those chapters are really in three sections. I'm referring to the book for some of these headings. The first section is chapter one is an excellent introduction and is called Your Job is Not Your Job. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then chapter two, chapter three, chapter four, and five are the challenges that any leader has to face that Fred refers to as unsolvable. There is disengagement. There is disorganization, is what chapter three is about. Chapter four, disinformation. And chapter five, disillusion. And we'll talk about each of these. And then in the next section, he refers to soft, quote unquote, soft people centered solutions to the hard organizational problems of disengagement, disorganization, disinformation, and disillusion. And those solutions, those people centered solutions, are motivation, how to motivate people with purpose, principles, and people. So, how to motivate through purpose, principles, and people. Culture, defining, demonstrating, demanding, and delegating so as to create and sustain a very positive, effective, impactful culture. What he calls responsibility, which is a concept that he outlined in Conscious Business some years ago. To be part of the solution, you have to be part of the problem. So, a key leadership concept and solution to these unsolvable problems he referred to earlier is this notion of being 100% responsible for everything that happens to us. And we'll talk about that in a little bit because I think it's a core concept. And the author absolutely keeps coming back to it as critical to effective leadership. Collaboration, the skill of healthy partnered collaboration, which is different than, and part of that is escalation. And as he says, escalation is not confrontation. And finally, integrity and the need for leadership integrity and what that means exactly. Now, there's a third part of this book that is really what I think is more philosophical. He actually refers to Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and some real heady notions of leadership and self-actualization. Fred plays in that space, which I think is really cool and really useful. And I'm not focusing on that for purposes of this talk. I'm focusing on leadership and organizational culture. I'm leaving out some of these things that are a little higher and more evolved. And I also wanted to leave those out just to leave you with a little sense of wanting more. Um, Chapter 11 is called Get Over Yourself and about leaders not putting themselves in the middle of things. Chapter 12 is called Die Before You Die, and about this notion of facing your shadows so you can live how you need to live now because you have faced death to a certain degree. Literally, it's getting into that level of depth and really provocation in a productive way. Chapter 13 is called Be a Hero, and it's about the hero's journey. Chapter 14 is called Superconscious Capitalism. And I'm going to leave that at that because I want to focus on the first 10 chapters for purposes of this talk. There's a lot to work with here. So as the author puts it, the meaning revolution explores a paradigm shift from matter to meaning. Stop this for a moment. A paradigm shift from matter to meaning, from compensation, command, and control to purpose, principle, and people, and from management to leadership. From management to leadership. So, as I mentioned, chapter one is an overview of the book, and he tells a lengthy story about a workshop that he did, etc. And I a few points from that chapter that is real, I think, is very, very interesting. And as you may have seen from the slide earlier, that chapter is about your job is not your job. And what he means by that is your job is to help the company win, to help the organization succeed, not to help sell more widgets, reduce cost, increase yield on some raw material. So in other words, my role is not my job. Everyone in the company has the same job, and that is to help the company be successful. And if we continue to focus solely on our roles, then the organization is going to suffer. Where, as he puts it, if you're going to focus on optimizing your system, then you're going to sub-optimize the organization. So if you optimize your subsystem, you sub-optimize the system. So he uses the example of, and I've heard him speak about this a number of times actually, about a soccer match where he's from Argentina. Let's call it a football match. If you're a defenseman, your job is what? To prevent goals. That's your job. But what happens if the team is losing 2-1? If the team loses 2-1, are you successful because you only allowed one goal? Um, if you're a staunch defenseman, you'd say, yeah, absolutely, we had a great game, but you lost. So what's your job? Your job's to help the team win. So that might mean that sometimes the defenseman has to switch over and go into goal scoring mode because the job of everybody on that pitch is to help the team win. And he goes on at length about this notion of if we focus on optimizing our subsystem, then the whole system loses and can't possibly produce at the same level. So how can we get out of our own subsystems and see a larger point of view? And he starts with that in chapter 1 because I think it's so central to his thesis that we have to get out of localized thinking, especially localized incentivized thinking, that I'm going to be rewarded for only giving up one goal, even if we lost. And how do you balance that with a practical incentive system? So again, a lot to talk about here. Let me go back to sharing my screen and going back to this point. True leaders do not have followers because the best leadership inspires followership to the mission, not to the leader. So as I've heard him say servant leadership is a bit of a misnomer if we're talking about serving people, because in his view, I think this is maybe slightly confrontational. In his view, we're not all in service to me or to you as the leader. He says, I'm not going to give my heart and all of my efforts to you. I'm going to give it to the mission, to the noble purpose of the organization. And the best leaders elicit that type of ethic and dedication to the mission, not to the leader, right? And the mission lives on and survives the leader. Leaders can change. The mission is what it is. He said that in an interview, when he was interviewed to come work for LinkedIn, and he sat with, I think it was with Jeff Weiner at the time, not Reed. And Jeff said, "Come join us." And Fred said, "I don't know if I really could come. I've been a consultant for a very long time. I don't know that I could come. Kind of be an inside cat again." These are my words, not his. And follow your leadership. I'm not nothing personal. I don't know if I can dedicate myself to a leader like this. He said, no, don't follow me. Follow the mission. Don't serve me or support me. Support the mission of this organization. And he said that was a deal breaker to be describing the focus and the effort and and leadership in that way. So I think that's pretty cool. So the author talks about leaders who lead in this way as transcendent leaders. So transcendent leaders inspire followership not by relying on carrots and sticks as workplace incentives and the like, threats of firing people, that would be a stick. Not by relying on carrots and sticks, but by appealing to the belief that they have spent their waking time doing some good in the world. So if we're leading in this way, if we're motivating people in this way, inviting people to serve the mission this way, that's transcendent leadership as he defines it. As he says, the job of every leader is to elicit people's internal commitment to pursue a common goal. And this is done by making a transcendent offer that gives people a sense of significance. A sense of significance. I think that's very interesting and very impactful from a leadership point of view. So when he talks about motivation, The principles of or the pillars, as he calls it, of intrinsic motivation, intrinsic meaning self-driven, not extrinsic, driven by money or titles or things like that, outer recognition, but by intrinsic, internally driven motivation. The four pillars there are purpose, which means significance, meaning, impact, service, self-transcendence. What is my purpose? What is the meaning of my work? How do I feel significant? That's purpose. Principles, which means integrity, ethics, morality, goodness, dignity, those types of principles can motivate us. People, and by this he means belonging, connection, community, recognition, respect, and praise. So what are the people-focused dimensions of motivation that can be brought out of us as we serve in an organization? And finally, the fourth pillar of intrinsic motivation is autonomy. And that means freedom, creativity, achievement, learning, self-mastery. So what are the ways in which, if I'm working in an organization, I can have more autonomy, and that provides more motivation for the work that I'm doing, for me to show up in a stronger way that way. I think that's a really, really interesting point and something to think about in our leadership. And if we coach leaders, what does that mean in terms of how we're coaching? Okay, we talked about that. Okay, before we get to culture, I want to hold on for just a second here before we get to culture, because there are a few other points to make here. As I mentioned early in the book, he talks about some of the challenges that leaders face and how they're really unsolvable. And because they're unsolvable, we need to lead through meaning, and we need to be in touch with our noble purpose. That is what will draw us to greater performance, greater leadership, greater sense of meaning individually and as an organization. Because, as he points out, disengagement is a huge problem in organizations. He said some organizations practice what he calls scientism, which is the profoundly unscientific attempt to transfer the methodology of physical sciences to the study of human action. In other words, we treat people like molecules. We heat them a certain way and apply heat. We handle them in a certain way, and we expect that people are going to behave like unconscious, tangible objects or and the like. So we take a scientific approach to leadership. Obviously, that's the opposite of something like emotional intelligence, where we're treating people as people. But he says very often, especially in certain types of organizations, this approach is taken that will just treat people in a certain objective, or just motivate them with money. That's perfectly fine. That's sufficient. Research shows that that is not really effective. Doesn't work. And there's a number of different ways he describes how people are disengaged, and the tragedy of disengagement, as he calls it. Also, disorganization, and this notion of disorganization, meaning this tension between incentives that pits the organization against itself. At the beginning of the book, he talks about the customer service representative at Comcast some years ago who refused to let a subscriber cancel her subscription. And the subscriber recorded the phone call. It went viral. It did a lot of damage to Comcast's reputation. The customer service person was doing his job of keeping the customer, although he did it to such an extreme extent. He was relentless in keeping this customer. It was obnoxious, and it backfired royally against the organization. So in an effort to meet my key performance indicator of retain customers, when I get that phone call from somebody who wants to cancel, I'm pushing and pushing and pushing to such a degree that it's detrimental to the organization and comes back to hurt the reputation of the organization. I've been privy to some of those conversations myself as a customer, thinking, well, if I ever was gonna, oh, and vice versa. There's times when a customer service person has handled things so well, and you know that they are incentivized by keeping customers and by, right, that's what they're measured by. And yet they let me go in a kind way and said, if this service isn't working for you, then that's perfectly fine. We hope to see you again sometime down the road. Much better for the whole organization. So the disorganization, as he says, to win, everybody must play for the team, not just be focused on my specific role as a defenseman, for example. So chapter 3 talks about that disorganization. Chapter 4, another example of an unsolvable challenge for leaders is what he calls disinformation, meaning that people have different information and make different inferences from that information. And that's partly because they only see a portion of what's happening. That's just a function of division of labor and responsibility. If I'm in sales, I don't know what's happening in service or supply or whatever in IT. And so I'll make a decision that's really limited by my point of view. And uh, a leader in any function like that can't possibly have a landscape view, a zoom out balcony view of the whole organization. And that hurts decision making. Of course it does. And that is essentially unsolvable. We can only do our best with that. We have to surrender to the fact that we only have so much information. And he also describes disillusion. So the expression that I like very much here is hell hath no fury like a follower disillusioned, right? So, as he says, leaders who want to inspire their companies through vision and values, right? So, if you want to engage people and you want to talk about our vision, and you want to talk about our values, you better mean it. Because as he says, leaders who do that make a double or nothing bet. If they succeed, people will fully engage and the organization will soar. But if they fail, people will actively disengage and the organization will sink. So that's the example of the leader who says, oh, we're committed to fairness and we take care of our people or whatever. But if you don't back it up, you're worse off than if you never made that public statement and held yourself out as an example in the first place, right? So hence, as he talks about the critical importance of integrity in leadership, if we're going to extend ourselves and say, this is what we value, then we better mean it. We better mean it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about culture, because culture is the place. Oh, actually, I want to come back to one other piece here. I refer to this notion of um, eliciting people's internal commitment to pursue a common goal. And the way we do that, very importantly, is the author says, is through identifying what he calls a noble purpose. He didn't invent this concept, but this notion of a noble purpose. And as he says, deep down, every company has a noble purpose. It just needs to find it. And here's how. How would you describe to a 7-year-old child what your company does in a way that he or she would be proud of you? How would you describe what your company does, what your work is, and also what the company does in a way that a child would be proud of you? That's your noble purpose. And this is a great exercise to focus people on noble purpose, to talk about really what are we doing here? And especially in this great resignation time, or whatever this new economy might be called, retention is very tough. People are leaving jobs. Good talent is perhaps harder than ever to find, certainly harder than ever to keep. How do we engage people through something larger? And how do we talk about what our organizations do in a way that a 7-year-old, how would I say that to my son when he was young, in a way that he would be proud? That's our noble purpose. And the way we can operationalize that on a day-to-day basis is through culture. So let's talk a bit about, see what the author says about culture. Culture acts as an emotional force field that aligns organizational members. And it does so without requiring financial incentives based on individual performance indicators. Interesting, right? Culture doesn't get people to align to something through money. Money doesn't drive culture, or at least not money alone. Money doesn't drive culture. This is because peers observe one another's environmental conditions, talent, and effort much more accurately than any manager. Cultural norms enforced through the threat of social sanctions, such as embarrassment, exclusion, and isolation, are much more effective than financial incentives to align an organization. So it's interesting, this language, the threat of social sanctions. In other words, the approval or disapproval of a peer, with a notion of, well, that's not how we do things around here, or you're letting the team down, or that was you did a great job even if we lost the customer, on the other hand. That's culture in action, and that's culture driving behavior, healthy behavior, values-driven behavior, much more so than a financial incentive could do. So I wonder, how do you feel about that? Do you think that's true? Do you think that's accurate? I'm curious. I'd like to know your thoughts about that. As another comment about culture. Strong culture engages employees around noble purpose, ethical values, and meaningful goals. This elicits their internal commitment. This is that intrinsic motivation, and provides a sense of individual and collective identity. So the us, the we dimension here. And most important, it does this without depending on formal control systems or reducing the autonomy required for excellent performance in complex, ambiguous, and constantly changing situations, right? So a healthy culture empowers people by providing autonomy. And the top line here, that's the bottom, and the top line here talks about engaging around noble purpose, ethical values, and meaningful goals. So you got my attention, and I'm locked in to this, and I'm engaged in this organization because of the purpose, because of the values and the goals. Again, I'd ask you, do you agree? How realistic do you think this is? Is this pie in the sky? I've seen these conversations happen and facilitated some of these conversations. In my experience, absolutely, this can happen. This does happen. I think it's a useful framework around which to engage people in conversations about culture. Although it may be aspirational and optimistic, maybe too optimistic for some organizations. The other thing that I've seen many times is that organizations can have very healthy subcultures. So one part of the organization is maybe very difficult, losing people, high attrition, poor leadership, etc. Whereas one could operate very, very differently. So I encourage you to think about the cultures in your organizations, as particularly in your sub organizations where you can develop a solid culture in the way that the author's talking about. And if the whole organization isn't on board with that, then they're not. But better to drive change through what I call the "I'll have what she's having" notion of how come everybody on that team seems to be engaged and happy? We don't have turnover issues. I mean, they don't have turnover issues the way we do, et cetera. They seem to be locked in. They seem to be getting higher engagement scores, et cetera. So subcultures are absolutely a thing to be honored. So the 4 pillars of an effective culture, just to talk about what does it mean? How do we break this down? High consensus, that means the degree to which members agree on values and norms. So the higher we agree on how we do things, the greater the extent to which we all sort of get how we do things, the more effective a culture will be. High intensity, and that means the strength with which members hold values and norms. How important is it to me? Right? So it's one thing to understand how we do things. We all understand how we do things. That's high consensus. But how important is it to me is high intensity. Productive content means the specific attitudes and behaviors defined by the behavioral norms. So it could be very clear what we're doing. It could be really important to me, but it could be something that's destructive. So let's be clear that all 3 of those things have to be present in order for the culture to be effective and sustaining and performing at a high level consistently. And the last one, high adaptability, this is where we get into the autonomy piece. The ease with which norms can change in the face, of environmental challenges. So high adaptability helps organizations avoid the dangers of rigid performance, right? So kind of command and control says, you're going to do things this way. Well, what happens in certain circumstances where we need to be flexible? If we can't be flexible, if we don't have high adaptability, then our culture is not going to serve us. So there's a quote on that. An effective culture must promote the freedom and support necessary for people to challenge assumptions, take risks, learn, and grow. When people feel safe, they're much more likely to offer ideas, to question the status quo, seek feedback, to experiment, reflect on results, and discuss errors or unexpected outcomes openly. So what he's arguing is, if this isn't happening, your culture is not healthy. I think that this connects closely to the notion of psychological safety in Google's Project Aristotle. I don't think that the author was at Google at the time that research was done around psychological safety, but I know that he relies on it now um, in his role. Of course, I believe he's still at Google. So when people feel safe, they're much likely to behave in these productive ways that will serve the whole organization. And this is where I think this concept is consistent with the theme of the book about, your job is not your role. Your job is to help the company win. And a healthy culture provides autonomy and flexibility. And as he called it, high adaptability. So question becomes, to what extent is that culture existent in your organization? Okay. Where's that? I'm jumping around. Okay. So there's a bit in the book about establishing a healthy culture and establishing cultural norms. And he refers to the establishment of cultural norms as a four-step process. I think this is very important from a leadership point of view. I referred to this earlier. Define the culture. So explicitly clarify the standards for expected behavior. How will we handle things? How do we do things? What is our norm, our cultural norm of behavior? To demonstrate that behavior. So leadership must demonstrate that. This may be obvious, but let's put it out there clearly. So I must behave according to the standard. So I'm going to define what it is. I'm going to behave that way. I'm going to demand. So the third D, define, demonstrate, and demand, is demand that type of behavior um, from others, right? So in other words, if somebody deviates from the standard, I need to confront them in a healthy way. So I need to define it, demonstrate it, demand it, and then delegate it. So require that everybody on the team will cascade that same behavior, that same willingness to confront when the norms are violated, etc. Define, demonstrate, demand, and delegate. I think it's a useful framework. Curious to know what you think. And I think I mentioned that the chapters 8, 9, and 10 talk about three essential process capabilities that are necessary parts of any effective culture. And and to that point, to effective leadership. And one of them, well, let me see, there's three, yeah, 8, 9, and 10. So one is about responsibility, as he calls it. What does that exactly mean? It's a bit of a clever play on words, not responsibility, but responsibility. So this is the notion of accepting full responsibility for our actions in any circumstance, even if we didn't create that circumstance. So that means instead of seeing and presenting yourself as a victim of forces beyond your control, you must see and present yourself as a player responding to a challenge. Only then will you have the moral authority to demand that everyone else do the same. So this comes back to this notion of demonstrating the behavior ourselves, the key role of integrity, and how we've got to walk the talk, because we hold out these lofty vision, values, etc., and we don't um, um, operate on that level, then the disillusionment goes through the roof, as we talked about earlier. One thing to call out here, when he uses the word a player, he's talking about somebody who is in the field of play, not somebody who's watching and observing, not a spectator, but I'm on the field, I'm on the court, I'm on the pitch, whatever sports metaphor we want to use, and I'm in it. I consider myself in order to be part of the solution, you've got to be part of the problem. And so it's a different, this is really almost like a philosophical or conceptual way. It's really a mindset. And this is something that I've worked with and taught for a number of years. This is not about saying that it's my fault that there was traffic, but it is about saying that I'm responsible for managing the traffic. And I must be able to respond to the circumstances, hence this hyphenated responsibility. Responsibility is the ability to choose one's response to a situation, focusing on the aspects of reality that you can influence, instead of feeling victimized by circumstances we can't control. There are some circumstances I can't control. This isn't about denying reality. The question becomes, what do I focus on when something goes wrong? Do I focus on, is nothing I could possibly have done? Or will I focus on how might I have anticipated this better? How might I have contributed to this or enabled this in some way to happen? What can I do better next time? Um, it's looking for opportunities to take responsibility. It's much more of a protagonist. Um, I'm in charge of what's happening to me in my life and how I respond to it in my life and in my work. So it's a very, very powerful mindset notion. As he said, it's about being the main character in your own life. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? We all do that from time to time. Why is this happening to me? Better to ask, what can I do when this happens? And as he says, it means you don't take anything personally. If it rains, it's not raining on you. It's just raining. So instead of blaming the rain, can you carry an umbrella? And there's some language in the book here that actually is he brought over from his earlier conscious business book that talks about language, victim language versus player language, as he calls this word. Sometimes people prefer protagonist to player, but that's the notion. But very, very important for purposes of meaning and maintaining focus on that larger purpose that we get out of victim thinking. Not avoid it entirely because we're human beings and there's times when we're going to feel like victims. That is human, but not to get stuck in it, not to get stuck in it. And in fact, when I've worked with this concept, I have found that it's maybe most useful in terms of a team or a group supporting one another so that when we will naturally from time to time feel like victims of something, our customer, collapsed and we were counting on this big order, or, somebody said that they were going to provide something to us. We couldn't do it. Therefore, we can't keep this promise. Um, how can we support one another to rise out of that victim thinking as quickly as we can? Because we're all going to be there sometimes. But how do we get out of it? How do we support one another to be more of that player protagonist, to be more able to respond to what's happening and not stuck in a feeling as though, something terrible happened to me. Why did this happen to me? But from his point of view, that's a critical leadership capacity. And I would agree. That's responsibility. He also talks about collaboration and what healthy collaboration is, and this notion of escalating collaboration. So when there's a conflict, what could I do to resolve this conflict with my colleague? And then if necessary, to escalate it to someone with a higher point of view that can make a judgment call. When my colleague and I have been through a process of clarifying our own interests, clarifying what the restrictions are. For example, I feel attached to my position because I need to meet X goal. That's a restriction that's influencing my position. It could be that when it escalates to a leader, that leader can shift that restriction. That's possible. I don't have the power to do that. I don't have the power to change that goal, for example, or to shift that commitment that I might have unilaterally to meet that goal. So there's a 7-step process about escalating issues collaboratively that I think can be useful. And finally, he talks about integrity. And I've been talking about this during here for a few moments. And integrity is honoring your word. And Fred describes this in a particular way, in a very specific way. Some of that is we just understand that integrity means we're going to keep our word, we're going to keep our promises. But he goes further with it. A person with integrity keeps her promises whenever possible and still honors them if she's unable to keep those promises. So let's break this down. You make a clear promise by committing only to deliver what you believe you can deliver. You keep the promise by delivering it. And you can still honor the promise even when you can't keep it by letting the other person, the person you're promising something to, letting that person know the situation and taking care of the consequences. So very importantly, it's not just about making a commitment with an awareness and an understanding and a reasonably high level of certainty that you can keep it. But when we make those commitments, even if something should happen, some circumstance should arise that I can't keep this commitment anymore, I can still honor the commitment by going back to the person and saying, this is what has come up. I'm no longer able to keep this commitment to do X by certain time. up to a certain standard, for example, because something else has come up. I'm coming to you to honor my commitments, even if I can't keep it. Very, very important part of how he describes integrity. Also a really, really useful thing to discuss with a team or as a leadership principle. He talks about the steps to making a commitment, what it means to really honor a commitment. That's part of this discussion as well in that integrity chapter. So a question that I would have for you as you look at this material or hear about these questions is, which themes are most relevant for you and your clients and your organizations and your stakeholders? What's most important? Is it about a noble purpose, identifying what may be our noble purpose? Is it about recognizing what our culture is and starting to be more purposeful about creating a culture deliberately and purposefully that's aligned with that noble purpose? Is it about these skills of leadership around being a player, as he calls it, responsible, being responsible that way, collaborating effectively, having high integrity? Is that what it is? Or is it more broadly, how can we recognize what our jobs are as distinct from what our specific roles are? And how can we influence our organizations to pay attention really to the former, to focus on what our collective jobs are and how all our jobs really are the same to help the organization win? And then what can we do to communicate that effectively? So I invite you to think about that. What would you like to pay more attention to? What might your next steps be with this material? So this is the meaning resolution. Some impressive endorsements here of this book. I think it's a good read, an easy read, good stories. An easy read, but a challenging read. I think it challenges us to think about things differently and how we really could up our game as leaders or as people who influence and support leaders, as I do. Um, good material. So I invite you to contact me um, at any time with questions you may have about this or how you could use it. I think it's fascinating, provocative, useful, and I would highly recommend it. The Meaning Revolution, Leading with the Power of Purpose. That's at least the subtitle on my copy. Or Leading the Meaning Revolution, The Power of Transcendent Leadership, which is the other subtitle, as I mentioned earlier. So good luck. Enjoy the book. I look forward to being in communication with you about it. See you next time.